Alrighty. Well, good morning, everyone. Yes, my name is Clay. I think I know most people in here. I'm from the area. I grew up in the Cleveland area, Northeast Ohio, and currently I'm a ministry resident at City Church. Thank you, Maisha, for organizing this, getting this together. Thank you, Tara, for making the chocolates there. If you guys see over there, you guys can take one as you go out. What I'd like to do during this time really is to kind of explain the origins of the book, share why I wrote it, what inspired me to write it, and then share a little bit about the book itself. So here's the book, by the way, and there is also some right there. The idea for this book first came to me in 2017, the summer of 2017, which is actually when I read the Harry Potter series for the first time. And as I was reading through it, I obviously, I really enjoyed it, but I began to see some of these connections between the Harry Potter series and the biblical storyline. And at that point in my life, I had never heard anyone talk about these connections. So almost everyone I know growing up had read this series. I had plenty of friends that had read it, but no one had shared those connections with me. And moreover, I grew up going to church, and I had heard many pastors reference all sorts of books and movies and stories of all kinds. But I had never heard anyone make a reference to the Harry Potter series. And so I thought, maybe this book should be written. And then by the time I got to the end of reading the Harry Potter series, it became obvious to me that these connections were very intentional on the part of J.K. Rowling. I came across an interview she did where she said that the religious parallels to her have always been obvious, but she never wanted to talk too openly about them because, for some people who just wanted the book, she wanted them to just be able to have the book. So then a couple years later, in the summer of 2019, I was rereading the book series, and that's when I began to sketch out the book. I began to sketch out what the chapters would be, what they would look like. It was also during that time that I read J.R.R. Tolkien's essay on fairy stories. And in that essay, Tolkien, he wrote The Lord of the Rings. He was also a literary scholar, a professor at Oxford. And he wrote this near the end of his life. And in the essay, he unpacks why he believes that we read fairy stories, fairy tales. And at the end of that essay, he makes a pretty profound claim. He says that the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, contain the greatest conceivable fairy story. And moreover, that this fairy story has entered into history, has entered into reality, as he said. And therefore the corollary of that would be that all stories, all fairy stories would have echoes of the gospel in them. And that's how I came up with the title, Echoes of the Gospel in Harry Potter. And I can only talk about a few of them now, you have to read the book. But I'll unpack, the book has 20 chapters, and I'll touch on a few of them right now. So you can't really talk about the themes in the Harry Potter series without talking about love, and particularly sacrificial love. This is how the series starts. The very first chapter, Lily Potter sacrifices herself to save her son and vanquishes Voldemort. This is, the opening chapter of the book. And at the end of the first book, we learn more about this in a conversation between Dumbledore and Harry when they're in the hospital wing. And Harry asks Dumbledore why Professor Quirrell wasn't able to touch him. And Dumbledore's answer is, your mother died to save you, and to have been loved so deeply, even though the person who loved us is gone, will give us some protection forever. So the story begins with sacrificial love. In the fifth book, we learn also that this is why Dumbledore sent Harry to be raised by his aunt in the first place. And the power of Lily's sacrifice was in her shed blood. Dumbledore says to Harry, your mother's sacrifice made the bond of blood the strongest shield I could give you. While you can still call home the place where your mother's blood dwells, there you cannot be touched or harmed by Voldemort. He shed her blood, but it lives on in you and her sister. Her blood became your refuge. Now, behind all this talk of sacrifice and blood is the idea that love is the most powerful form of magic in the wizarding world. And this is something that Dumbledore and Voldemort disagree strongly on. In fact, it's right at the heart of the disagreement between the two. But Dumbledore believes that love is more powerful than any other force in the world, even death. And of course, he's right, because in the series, love does protect Harry from death, both at the very beginning, as we just saw, but also at the very end, as we'll see later. And it's here that we're really at the very heart of the gospel, near the heart of the gospel, because the Bible speaks often of the love, of the sacrifice, and even the blood of Jesus. If you want to see what love looks like, the New Testament writers say again and again, look at the death of Jesus. Look where he shed his blood for the world. And likewise, just like Lily, Jesus' blood has a protective power to it. He compared it to the Passover lamb, the lamb that was the Israelites slaughtered and then painted the blood on the doorframe of their homes when they were enslaved in Egypt. And the idea was that the blood would serve as a covering or a protection. And so also Jesus' blood protects from sin and ultimately from death. It is a love that conquers death itself, which is why it results in resurrection. But that is getting ahead of ourselves a little bit. Death is the chief enemy, both in the Bible and in Harry Potter, though of course there are other enemies as well, and they share that, particularly since J.K. Rowling chose a verse from the Bible that deals with death as the theme for the whole series, and that's 1 Corinthians 15:26, the last enemy that shall be destroyed is death. And the quotation appears on a tombstone in the 7th book in Godric's Hollow, on the tombstone of Harry's parents. And it comes from the Apostle Paul's famous chapter on resurrection in his letter, 1 Corinthians. He's unpacking the resurrection of Jesus, the implications of it. And it's actually one of two explicit Bible verses in the Harry Potter series. Both of them appear on tombstones in Godric's Hollow in the 7th book. And J.K. Rowling said of these, they sum up, they almost epitomize the whole series. So she saw these two as where the whole series was going. Could be summed up in these two verses. The other one was from Matthew chapter 6. But just as a side note, interestingly, when J.R.R. Tolkien was asked, what the Lord of the Rings was all about, he said, death and the desire for deathlessness. So it's interesting, these two stories, Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter, shared this as the common theme, really, of the core theme, in both of them. But death is a key theme throughout the Harry Potter series, and there are two paths laid out to conquer it. The first one is Voldemort's path, and this is, book 4. When Voldemort rebuilds his body, he's very clear about this, that his chief goal is to conquer death, and thus he aptly names his followers the Death Eaters. And his pathway to going about conquering death is through creating Horcruxes. These are these objects that he hides parts of his soul in and scatters them. And so this is therefore a very dark way of trying to conquer death, because it involves murder. That's how you create these Horcruxes. And so Voldemort is after immortality, but more than that. He's, because Dumbledore says he chose not to go after a Sorcerer's Stone, for instance. He didn't want to be dependent on anything, not even the Sorcerer's Stone, to extend his life. So in his pursuit of immortality, Voldemort is after independence. He's after invincibility. He doesn't want he doesn't want to be dependent on anything or anyone. And I personally see an echo there of the Genesis 3 account, of the original sin, of the man and the woman in the garden, told not to eat from the fruit of the tree, and the serpent coming along and saying that, if you eat from this fruit, you will be like God. You will have the knowledge of God. And so, of course, the man and the woman eat. And it is a tempting lie. Others fall prey to it throughout the Harry Potter series, even Dumbledore and Harry, for brief stretches of time. Although in their case, they're not in the pursuit of Horcruxes, but the Deathly Hallows. They're after immortality. They're after invincibility. And for both of them, it does not go well. It leads to devastating consequences in both cases. In fact, it leads to someone's death in both cases. And this brings up another theme darkness or evil. J.K. Rowling was asked about the darkness of the story many times, especially a series that escalated in its darkness, especially for young children. Dark magic, the dark arts, and this was her response. She said in an interview, I have a real issue with anyone trying to protect children from their own imaginations, and I think that a lot of this goes on. And if we cannot acknowledge and embrace the fact that we all have a certain degree of darkness within us, some more than others perhaps, and bring it into the light and examine it and talk about it, this part of the human condition, then I think we will be living in quite a dangerous climate, and I think that's much more damaging for children. So for J.K. Rowling, she's saying the world is not divided in between good people and bad people. She's saying there's good and evil within each person, and this is an idea that makes its way into the Harry Potter series as well. And perhaps most clearly in a quote from Sirius Black, where he says, the world is not divided between good people and Death Eaters. And he says, we all have measures of darkness and light within us. So there's darkness within each person that must be dealt with. But in Harry Potter, there's also a more insidious form of darkness. And it's right there from the beginning, in Book 1. At the end of Book 1, when Harry and Dumbledore are talking, Dumbledore tells Harry that it is important to keep fighting evil again and again, for only then can evil be held at bay, even if never finally defeated. In other words, evil would just, if you keep fighting, and he's saying it's going to show up again and again over the years, taking on different forms. And Snape likewise said of the dark arts, he said, the dark arts are like a many-headed monster, such that if you cut off one head, a more powerful one is simply going to sprout up in its place. And we see this in the story, because you have the rise of Grindelwald and his tyrannical regime, and then when he's defeated just a few decades later, you have the rise of Voldemort, and the two are very similar, and their regimes are very similar. Snape was right. When you defeat one, another more powerful head simply grows in its place. And this reflects the biblical teaching as well. The Apostle Paul says that there is no one righteous, no, not one. Jesus' teaching was very similar. The Bible throughout teaches this, that there is darkness or evil within each person. There is a bent within each person. But the Apostle Paul also said in a letter, our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. And so in the Bible and in Christianity, there's not just darkness within humans, there's a larger than life, a superhuman form of evil as well. And consequently, then, how darkness is to be defeated is a major theme in the Harry Potter series as well. The Ministry of Magic resorts to using violence to fight evil and darkness. They use the unforgivable curses. They employ dark creatures, the Dementors, to fight Voldemort. But Dumbledore shows a different way. And after Cedric Diggory dies in the 4th book, in his speech to the school, Dumbledore says, Lord Voldemort's gift for spreading discord and enmity is very great. We can fight it only by showing an equally strong bond of friendship and trust. And Dumbledore again is vindicated here, as he shows that the only way to defeat darkness and evil is that you have to be plunged into it. You have to let it do its worst to you, and that's where the series is ultimately going. And that's what the final 2 chapters in my book are devoted to. One with Dumbledore when he goes to the cave, and I'm not going to talk about that now, but this is the last chapter of my book, talking about Harry himself at the end of the 7th book. In the chapter 33 of the 7th book, Harry goes into Snape's memories, he watches Snape's memories, and he realizes that he is the Horcrux that Voldemort never intended to make, and he realizes that he must die in order for Voldemort to be beatable. And so in chapter 34, which is actually the final chapter that J.K. Rowling wrote, and that makes sense because it's a very climactic chapter in many ways, Harry takes the slow, long walk all the way from Dumbledore's office into the Forbidden Forest. And the chapter is sort of like a Gethsemane experience, is what I'm calling it, and kind of named after the garden that Jesus went into to pray the night before he was crucified. And you see Jesus wrestling with, knowing what he had to do, but you see his agony, you see his sorrow, and you see this in the description, a very vivid description of what Harry does as he walks from Dumbledore's office into the Forbidden Forest. And Jesus ultimately goes to the cross. He realizes that this is the only way to defeat the powers of sin and death. And likewise, Harry finally realizes that this is what he has to do. He has to go into the forest and let himself be killed by Voldemort. This is the only way to defeat Voldemort. But strangely, this is also how death is defeated in Harry Potter, because when Harry is finally hit with the killing curse, he winds up in what looks to him like King's Cross Station. Now, the train station is named after a monument to King George, but as J.K. Rowling says, it is an evocative and symbolic name, because Jesus claimed to be the Messiah. He claimed to be the King of Israel, and he was enthroned, strangely, on a cross. I mean, that is the story the four Gospels are telling, of Jesus eventually being enthroned as the king on a cross, and thus it is a fitting destination for Harry after he has mirrored the suffering of Jesus so closely. And when he is there in King's Cross Station, he meets Dumbledore, who tells him that he is the worthy possessor of the Deathly Hallows, and Dumbledore says to him, "You are the true master of death, because the true master does not seek to run away from death." And thus we see in the Harry Potter series that death is defeated by submitting to it. Again, much like Jesus, who defeated death through dying. And Dumbledore goes on to say, you're not dead. Actually, Lily's sacrifice has kept him alive. Because when Voldemort rebuilt his body with Harry's blood, he took Lily's blood as well, thus strengthening the power of her sacrifice and tethering Harry to life, which leads then to the final theme, which is resurrection, where Harry comes back to his body in the last chapter of the book series. And not like in Godric's Hollow, though. There's a conversation between Harry and Hermione in Godric's Hollow in the 7th book, where they first come across this quotation, "The last enemy that shall be destroyed is death," on Harry's parents' tombstone. And Hermione goes on to say, this means living after death or living beyond death. But Harry's, brought to tears by this, because he knows that, living beyond death, living after death, is not the same thing as actually destroying death. His parents' remains are lying there right in front of him. And that's what makes Harry's resurrection experience, we'll say, different, because he comes back to his body. And in this final chapter, then, we have not so much an echo, but as my friend says, a shout of the gospel. And there's many parallels to the resurrection stories in the Gospels in this final chapter. You have the grief of the women at Jesus' tomb and his disciples, and they're thinking him dead. But then when he rises again, it turns to joy. The grief turns to joy. And likewise, Harry's friends, when they see his limp body, there's grief, there's sorrow. But then when they see him, alive again, there is great joy. We have the power of Voldemort's curses broken in that final chapter. Voldemort's curses don't work the way that they're supposed to. Something about Harry's death has broken their power of darkness. And likewise, Jesus' death in some way breaks the power of darkness. You have the head of the snake in that last chapter, cut off. Nagini's head is cut off, which is actually a pretty strong echo of the very first prophecy in the Bible, in Genesis chapter 3, where the seed of the woman would crush the head of the snake, so that when Jesus rises again, in John chapter 20, and he rises again, his resurrection takes place in a garden. He was buried in a garden. And when he rises again, there is no serpent to be found in this garden. The serpent has been defeated. We have the theme of the sun rising, after the long dark night of the Battle of Hogwarts and all that went into it. You have the sun rising as Harry has his resurrection experience. And likewise, Jesus rises again on Easter morning. But it's more than that, because the New Testament writers proclaim that not only did Jesus rise again, but that a new day had dawned, a new age had begun, that the world is a different place. And then, of course, evil is finally defeated. Voldemort is finally defeated. Which leads then to the epilogue. The last few pages of the book, where we get a little window into life post-Voldemort. And two things stand out, I think, in the epilogue. The first one is that there's no chance of evil coming back. When Harry rubs his scar, I think that's the last line in the book, it says, "The scar had not pained Harry for 19 years. All was well." So what had been a great source of pain now is gone, and there's no chance now of Voldemort coming back. And the second thing that stands out in the epilogue is that this is not an end, but a beginning. Because even though it's just a picture, we do see that life goes on. Children are still going to Hogwarts, Harry's kids, Ron and Hermione's kids, and so on. It's not just an end, but it's a beginning. And both of these ideas are present as well in the final vision in the Bible, in the book of Revelation, where we have a vision of all tears wiped away, of no sorrow, no pain anymore, of death being gone, death truly being destroyed, and no chance, again, of evil coming back. And secondly, in that vision, we have a picture of the garden city, of humanity worshiping and reigning with Jesus forever. And this is, just a glimpse of it, just picture language. But it is a picture, and it's a picture of a world that the Harry Potter series is an echo of, in which truly the last enemy, death, has been destroyed. So that concludes my presentation. At this time, though, before people can go purchase the book, I'm open to taking questions if people have any. If you want to ask a question, I'm willing to answer. Or you could ask when I'm sitting up there, too. You could ask a question.